your taste, your sensibility is much more flexible than a lot of people allow. One thing you have to do as a critic is be prepared to fall for stuff you don't think you should like.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Roberta Smith is the exemplar of popular art criticism. For almost 4 decades, Smith was a familiar voice at the New York Times, serving for many of those years as co-lead art critic. Both feared and revered, she is known above all for close-looking, precise description, and a style that's accessible but serious. In 2019, she won the Rabkin Foundation Award for Lifetime Achievement. Smith moved to New York in the late 1960s, studying at the Whitney's Independent Study Program and meeting her first mentor, the sculptor Donald Judd. In the early 1970s, she worked at the Museum of Modern Art and Paula Cooper Gallery, then began writing for various art magazines. In the 1980s, she started writing for larger audiences at the Village Voice and then for the Times, starting in 1986. Smith retired 2 years ago, but this week she is back in the conversation because of a film called House of Criticism, which is about her and her husband, New York Magazine art critic Jerry Saltz, and it's making its debut at the Tribeca Film Festival. I took that as my cue to interview someone who has shaped the worlds of art making and art writing so deeply. Smith was nice enough to talk to me about her method, what she thinks people get wrong about the art world, and what she's looking at now. Well, Roberta Smith, thank you very much for doing this interview with me today. I'm very excited to do it.
Well, thank you for asking me.
So you retired a couple years ago. You were the, of course, famous longtime co-lead critic for the New York Times. What have you been up to? Are you still out and about seeing galleries?
Well, 4 months after I retired, I broke my foot, which really underscored retirement in a kind of uncomfortable way. So I suddenly stopped going to the Times because I didn't work there anymore. And I stopped going to galleries and sort of had a very long, dark night of the soul, I would say. Like, you give up something like the Times and what that job meant to me and how it identified me, and it's a shock. I will put it any other way. I sort of didn't know who I was. You know, I used to always say that I didn't know if I'd ever write after I left the Times, that I felt so, I don't know, like I was really in a kind of slot or a place where it seemed to work for me.
Yeah.
And I really loved the dynamic of working with editors and seeing shows and writing quickly and being in print. And all of that was like this wonderful little triangle.
And a routine, I imagine.
It was a routine, yeah. It sort of determined my life. And I liked working with editors. I liked feedback. I liked being edited. And they're very much a part of the process for Times writers, I think. It was my experience.
Was there any part of you that was relieved? I know you said you didn't even know how you would look at art when you weren't thinking about what you would review each week.
Actually, I'd forgotten about that. It was time for me to go. I was, whatever I was, 75, and I had been there a long time. I was having more and more difficulty meeting deadlines, so that didn't work well.
It's punishing. The weekly.
Yeah, it didn't
that's
work well with
schedule.
anyone. And I wanted to see what was left, what I had left for me to do. Like, I was thinking, well, I could go work at an animal shelter, or, I was thinking of something radically different. And I really didn't know. I sort of just came to a halt. Everything came to a halt. And I think I haven't quite unraveled the significance of the broken foot. I think that it has some. So then I took on a couple of big writing pieces for me, and they took forever. I took forever to do them. I mean, people were about to shoot me. I wrote an essay on Uman, who's having a show at Bard, opening at the end of this month, actually, who isn't very well known, although I think she's a terrific artist and very symptomatic of the times. And then I went in the opposite direction and wrote a catalog essay for the John show that just happened at Gagosian.
Okay.
And both of them were kind of amazing because it was like, oh, okay, you can write, even without editors, although you're a bit too slow right now.
Well, that's interesting because you had to be so fast before. So is it like you got a voice in your head saying that you have to do something totally different?
Well, it was totally different. I'm not sure I was really a fast writer. I always think I'm a slow writer, that I can respond well to pressure. So once the pressure changes, there's no pressure like we need it for Friday, you know. But anyway, both of those essays were really satisfying to do. And the Johns essay, which is in print in this fabulous catalog they did of the show, because it produces everything on the show, plus installation shots, plus it reproduces the show at Castelli in 1976. I don't know if you were aware of this. John's crosshatch paintings loom large in my New York experience.
Oh, yeah. No, I wasn't aware of that. How so?
Well, I saw the 76 show and I really was knocked out by it, really, and flummoxed. And I just think those are sort of arguably his greatest paintings. And certainly his most painterly and in some ways intuitive. That show was just amazing to me to see.
So it sounds like these writing projects are kind of passion projects for you. I mean, I guess I always wonder that. There's such an industry around art now. I always think that it's like when people don't have any business interest in it, if they're still interested in art, that means there's something there, you know?
Ben, I'm shocked. I don't know why, but I'm completely shocked by that. Because most people in the art world have a kind of marginal business interest. I mean, I don't think any of us is in it for the money.
Sure, yeah.
Or most of us aren't in it for the money.
No, yeah, sort of an aspiration of it being a career or something like that, yeah.
Well, I just think there's a kind of satisfaction that we get that is unequaled if you have that feeling for it. And I think everybody potentially has that feeling for it if they give themselves a chance. No, the Johns thing especially turned into a passion project because this is somebody I've written about a few times and I had never quite thought about it so much, had so much time to be with it. And I also had the benefit of, you can see it on the shelves there, Roberta Bernstein's catalog raisonné. And I just went over it and over it and over it, and I just got so many ideas from it. The catalog raisonné fell apart. I'd like to point that out to Yale. But anyway, they don't make books like they used to.
For the bookbinder.
But anyway, and now we've got, a couple of interviews connected to this movie thing that's happening at the end of this week. And after that, I don't know.
So you still observe the art world, though? I know you have thoughts about the gallery scene right now.
Well, the gallery scene is where I've spent most of my professional life. That and in certain museum exhibitions. I hate the demonization of art galleries. I think it's really wrong and inaccurate. And I'm not crazy about the big four, as you want to call them. But, they've done some amazing shows. And we live in a time of giantism, which is very unfortunate for just about anything you can name on every front. So the art world is not exempt from that. But there's hundreds of galleries that aren't part of that circuit.
In preparation for this, I went back and read some of your Village Voice writing. And there was one from the 80s that I read, I think, talking about overproduction. You were talking about David Sally's show and talking about, man, there's just way too much work here. And I was thinking how apt that seemed and how quaint, because
I know
the scale is just incomparable since then.
I know. Well, there's more of everything than there ever was before in history. So art isn't exempt. I always say to people, if you can be anything else than an artist, be that. Don't be an artist if you feel you have options. Because real artists are people who don't have options, who can only do that.
The demonization of galleries or the commercial side of the art world, where do you think that comes from?
Well, I just think that a lot of people have decided that dealers are kind of evil. And I'm sure there are enough dealers who can be cited as evidence, but I think that dealers are in this very weird position, which is they take something that an artist makes that the artist considers invaluable, and they convert it into cash. That's their job. And their job secondarily, although I actually think it's the primary job, is to be in charge of a space that is part of a larger conversation, to which we all have access free of charge. And they're the main conduit of art in any given city. And therefore, I don't know, I think they're amazing. I also dislike sectioning the art world into more or less evil professions. Artists, critics, curators, collectors, dealers. I think they can all be done really badly and really dishonestly, and they can be done excellently. And there's an element of creativity involved in all of these activities. And galleries in the time I've been here have taken on a lot of the jobs of museums. I mean, there have been great historic shows. But I think right now to demonize galleries, dealers as a group, is really naive. Think about the art world without them.
Mm-hmm.
Ken Johnson, I should say it was really fun to write at the Times with Ken Johnson, and he was the critic I felt closest to. But Ken went and wrote for the Boston Globe for a couple of years and came back to the Times, and he said, there are no galleries up there. There's no art world. You can't have it without them, without these, basically even now, small ma and pa businesses where a few people are making their own decisions about what they want to put on view for the rest of us to look at and think about. I think being a dealer is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And sure, there are temptations. A lot of money passes through your hands and you have to be very disciplined. I think one thing that doesn't get said enough is that galleries have lifespans, and they have different lifespans according to the people that run them. Like Metro Pictures, that was a specific, I forget what that was, 40 years?
Yeah.
Something like that.
40-year run, something like that.
And then they decided to end it.
It's so interesting. So you're retired and you're still looking in at the art system, not just the art, thinking about its health.
I've been in it since more or less, getting less and less naive as I proceeded. But I've been going to galleries since 1968. Very naively at first. That's why I remember the John show, because it was one of the first shows where I went back more than once and was really kind of like, oh, well, this is something different. What is up with this guy right now? But like I say, Jerry and I kind of lived our whole lives just going to galleries and talking to people at the desk and talking to dealers or talking to just the receptionists, because there are all kinds of great people who start out at the reception desks at galleries. So I have my own distortion. I idealize it, I romanticize it, but it's still the same. It's still very much the same if you go on certain levels.
Well, it's funny. I was going to ask you, just to get at the Roberta Smith origin story, I was going to ask you about Paula Cooper Gallery, because it was one of your first jobs, right? Did that affect the way you approached art?
Probably. I mean, I think Paula was very eclectic, loose. I think the way she approached art was almost kind of mysterious. And if you looked over her stable at any given point, there's a tremendous range. When I worked for Paula, which was beginning in 1972, Alan Shields was probably still supporting the gallery. He was the first young artist that I remember sort of selling like crazy for a while. And I just thought she had just a really interesting eye, to the other extreme with people like Judd and Andre. She liked their work.
Yeah.
She respected them very much. And
orbit, I guess. Yeah.
Later on, she did actually represent Judd for a while. I don't know about Andre. Maybe now. I can't remember. I think there was a kind of laissez-faire in that gallery where it didn't have a kind of house style.
Yeah.
I remember when I left Paula, I left to become a full-time critic, which wasn't full-time because you didn't make your money at it. But anyway, I remember Mel Bochter saying to me, well, now that you don't work for that gallery anymore, I could speak to you. So you could see that there was this
kind of walls, yeah,
sense of opposition to, if you think about, he's represented by Sonnabend and everybody that was there for 10 years.
Right.
And then the Germans arrived, so that completely.
And you think that the sort of the openness of it is strength, because openness to new things rather than a sharply defined.
I'm not sure it's an openness to new things. It's an openness. It's just an understanding that, I know you're going to ask me about ideology, so We all have one. I didn't mean to say I didn't have one, but I just think your affinities, whatever you want to call it, your taste, your sensibility is much more flexible than a lot of people allow.
Right.
One thing you have to do as a critic is be prepared to fall for stuff you don't think you should like. I knew Judd. I was sort of had a certain level of training working for him. And I came out of that very, very narrow.
Well, speaking of ideology, I was going to ask you about Donald Judd because you did his catalog raisonné, right?
I worked on it.
You worked on it.
I started it.
Very early. This is like one of your very first jobs.
This is mid-'70s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Somebody wrote a letter to the editor of Arts magazine. Remember that? When Judd was writing and said he was ideological, and he said, I don't mind being an ideologue if I'm right. I'm much looser. I think that you sort of take it on a case-by-case basis. Like, how am I responding to this? And can you actually reconcile liking this with liking that? And the answer is probably not. You can't.
I know people probably think of Donald Judd as the great minimalist, very rigorous style. Almost rigor is the definition of it, but also very influential on you as a critic, correct? Because he was a writer of some note who wrote about all kinds of things, right?
Well, Judd hated minimalism, which is to his credit. And, all these so-called movements, they only have really a few artists who are practicing them at the highest level. I mean, specific objects is not a precursor to minimalism. Specific objects is much more varied and eclectic. I mean, you had Richard Archwalder, Lucas Samaras, George Ortman, Alfred Jensen. That was an amazing group of artists. And he connected them in terms of the way they used material and the kinds of objects they made, which he thought probably were non-illusionistic. I mean, that was his big bugaboo, was this illusion of space. And
truth to materials. It's
yeah,
almost
truth to materials and truth to the object as object. So I don't think you can define him by or hang him on minimalism.
But as a writer, what do you think you took from him? Because I've read you say you really dug into his writing.
I read everything he wrote. I read the Yellow Book because I retyped it. I returned the Yellow Book.
Really good way to
totally
absorb
it turns
something.
out it's completely a journalistic method. I talked to other critic about it, and they said, oh yeah, we used to always do that. Before there was a Yellow Book, I went and took all these piles of arts magazines and typed all of his reviews back into manuscript form. You barely had to think. It just sort of went through my brain. And I think that the plainness of his writing and the relatively, I think, conversational nature of it. And also, he was very judgmental. I mean, he always had opinions. I don't think I was nearly as judgmental as Judd, because he had this, scheme, this program, and he could tell when people were
with the program
or not, and by degrees,
Well, so what do you think you took away from it? Some people might accuse you of being a formalist. I'm not sure I would, but I mean, his writing, there's a lot of rigor in its attention to materials and form.
Yeah. He wrote a great review about who chooses the vinyl that lines airplanes. So he understood subject matter when he was there. But I don't know if I'm a formalist or not. I probably am. I'm not that interested in narrative.
Right. Like backstory, I guess you'd say. Because backstory is a huge part of the contemporary art.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you can see and what you get from looking. If there's a whole backstory, some of it's very interesting, some of it is necessary. But in the end, you go through that and you still have to come back to just what you're looking at. Because not everybody's out there collecting the backstory. So I just want to start with looking and, what it brings up for me.
You have talked many times about going to the Village Voice, a big moment in your career. How'd that come about? And what was it's kind of a mythical time in the Village Voice's life for me. What was it like?
You have to remember I was sort of out of it wherever I was. So I wasn't really part of the Voice. I had a good friend who was a writer and who said, if you really want to be a critic, you have to get out of the art world.
Right. What did you mean by that?
You have to find a readership. And what he didn't say, which what I discovered, was that there's an immediacy to a place like The Voice. I've said this so many times. you're in print while the art you're writing about is on view. Art magazines are 6 weeks behind what the art world is looking at.
If you're lucky.
So that pressure was really intense. And it was like a kind of truth serum. It's like, I can't think about what anybody else was going to think about my writing. I have these people that are doing me the favor of reading me, and there's a certain responsibility there. And I just have to go forth, be as honest as I can. I have to write about stuff that I know about. I have to write about things that I probably know very little about, but that catch my eye in a certain way and excite me. And I think other people can become excited in looking at this. The Voice was great. I don't know, people would talk to me on the street and you would get reactions. The Times was that way too, but.
Sure, like times 1,000, yeah.
Everybody writing online probably has this, but it wasn't so usual.
Yes and no. I think writing online is very immediate, but it's very fragmented and in weird ways isn't an audience. Like that kind of anonymous audience that you're talking about, it's not necessarily, might not be the art audience. The online audience is very self-selecting, is what I'd say.
Well, anybody reading me in The Voice or The Times is self-selective. There's always that.
I guess that's true.
And as a writer, I think you have to take for granted a certain level of interest. Like, I don't have to explain minimalism every time I use the word, But the readership, the sense like, oh, I really love this. I can imagine other people loving this. That kind of immediacy. Most criticism is periodical literature, No, it's actually daily or weekly. The stuff that you really, like Pauline Kael at a certain point.
So you're writing for the Village Voice in the early 80s. I guess it's just interesting because to me, this is also the time on the other end of the spectrum when criticism getting really theoretical, And I always kind of view you as part of this group of popular critics who kind of, in a way, define themselves against the academic critics who had like a big voice in that moment.
Well, I'm basically kind of uneducated, except for through art and through catalogs and through artists. I didn't go to graduate school. I have never read much theory. It's probably a shame. I probably limited myself in a certain way because of that, of a certain kind of ignorance of that. But I also think that the art does guide you. The art requires certain things. Conceptual art didn't really have that much going on formally. So you were brought very close to specific subject matter and ideas. So in another way, I feel like art took care of that to an extent.
It took care of you. You didn't need to have read, I don't know.
There's trickle-down theory.
Have a PhD in order
through the art.
Yeah.
And you could combine that with your experience of it. I don't know. I was much more interested in sort of this, what was going on the ground, what you could see walking around gallery to gallery.
To me, I always thought that, you're writing, your husband, Jerry Saltz, Peter Sheldall, Walter Robinson, my former boss, are very great ambassadors for art to a large public, but also because they have this kind of foil in the background, which is the kind of theory adjacent academic art criticism that is another kind of stereotype for these things. We're almost able to speak for the common person in a way.
That we were.
Yeah.
First of all, you have to look at where we're publishing. The New Yorker, the Times, the Voice. I think that art has a much, much larger audience than it did when I first started. The art world was small, and I think a lot of things happened, some of which I participated in. I think that the arrival of outsider art and how that reshaped our idea of what greatness can be and where it can come from. That art has just been bludgeoned since about 1970 with everything that had been excluded. Women, artists of color, different kinds of so-called crafts. It's amazing to me what you can just see going gallery to gallery. And it's a much more complicated, worldly accumulation of stuff to look at, in addition to being much larger than any one person can keep track of.
It's a huge responsibility being the big voice of the New York Times, which is one of the most influential publications in the world. Did that hit you when you were doing it? Did you feel like you bore this huge weight?
I probably could have done more with it. when you're writing that often, you can't really think about that too much.
Yeah.
I have a much more nose to the ground ambition than some of the critics who were there. I mean, I didn't write these big pieces that much. You just did what you could get done. There are numerous pieces that I thought about and pitched and did not write. So it was a flawed enterprise.
There've been like a whole number of critics at the New York Times that you overlapped with. Did you learn from other people there?
Not really. I really enjoyed writing with Michael Kimmelman and Holland Cotter to some extent. Can't remember. John Russell brought me to the paper. Nobody even remembers who he is. He was chief critic. And Branson was there. I don't know, it was always interesting, just the divergent points of view.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. Do you think there's a house style, or do you think it's really the critics bring their individual voice?
Well, the Times is really, that was what's so great about writing for the Times. You were allowed to have a voice. You weren't heavily edited. You couldn't really write for the Times and be heavily edited. You couldn't create a lot of work for the copy desk, you know. You had to be able to get your stuff through it kind of intact. You had a sense of your own work writing there. I was doing something that was part of something that was larger, but it was still had my byline and my voice. And, you know, it attracted readers, certain readers that maybe didn't read all the other critics, and vice versa. People read Holland or Michael or Branson who didn't necessarily read me. So it was really great in that regard.
I think you've been important for people to a certain extent because you are the first woman to be the co-lead for the Times.
I think there was I'm the first co-chief.
Yeah, okay. I guess it's a quirky title.
Yeah. I don't think there was a woman chief critic before. There was definitely women there. Before Vivian Rayner, before Grace Gluck.
Well, I guess I was interested because I was reading a great interview you did with Jared Ernest, and you mentioned something about working with Betsy Baker at Art in America and Danielle Mattoon at the Times, and how working with a female editor kind of unlocked something for you when you first went there.
Well,
I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. I wanted to hear
Danielle
more
wasn't
about.
When I first went there. I mean, I worked under a good dozen culture chiefs, and Danielle was about the 10th.
Really?
Or the 8th or something
Relatively...
like that. But it just changed the atmosphere. I mean, the Times is still incredibly male and run by men.
But how so?
The way my neuroses worked with that particular situation, that I just felt more at ease. I used to be very frightened when I was in the paper. I had a little cubicle there, and I always thought, oh, these guys are just walking around. They're so at ease. They're talking to the culture chief. You know, how does that happen? And you know, that's my own problem, you know, and I think Me Too changed everything there too, at least for a while, you know. There were always more women in the culture department, but to have one right at the top.
Well, I do think there's something, if you want to just break things down in a very stereotypical way, something about the Robert Hughes-esque opinionated swagger that people associate with a certain kind of critical voice maybe excludes women sometimes.
Yeah, I'm very aware of that. I wrote this in the Uman essay. I'm very aware of the fact that there's all this talk about how there's no originality anymore, blah, 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 all being voiced emphatically by male critics. I remember when I first came into the art world, Lucy Lepard was very disparaging about the idea of judgment. And I thought, get over it. How can you say that? You know, you define yourself as a critic by what you write about negatively as well as positively. But I became less and less interested in that, in just delivering judgment, partly because there were so many artists to write about. There were so many shows that I saw and thought, I could write about that. I could, you know, and I just couldn't get around to it. We didn't have enough space. So in some ways, it seemed almost a waste of space. But I know that's not the case. Negative opinion is important. Sometimes I think of criticism as being very gendered. There's a male kind and there's a female kind. And I'm sure that can be applied to art history as well. The idea of authority.
It's funny because I think people do actually think of you not as opinionated, but as someone who actually is capable of delivering a pretty crushing blow. Yeah, and even in some of the debates about negative criticism that have come up in the last few years, or the lack of negative criticism, I think people point to some of the things you've written as like an example of how to do it. I guess you were just saying you don't think about it yourself as passing judgment like that.
Well, I pass judgment all the time in my head. I mean, I'm extremely judgmental. I think I kind of wound down a little toward the end, partly because I just thought, am I going to get out there and say yet again, this artist is derivative of that, I don't know who reviewed the Julie Meritou paintings on both sides, freestanding, but I do hope that one of them mentioned Donald Nelson, who's been doing that for years, to great effect. And I think is I shy away from the word great, but an outstanding artist, She just doesn't have the whole kind of persona, personality, or career that makes that kind of self-evident. And so when people complain about lack of originality, I just think there are so many good artists right now. They're just not in a cluster. They're just not necessarily with a big gallery. You have to go out and find them. And you have to let them change your idea about what originality is. It never happened in this kind of straight line. That was just where we happened to be looking at that time.
Art history, that is.
Yeah, or invention. Any of that stuff. We spent the last 50 years expanding art, discovering artist after artist who was working in the 50s, this or that. On the other hand, I will say that not every artist has been overlooked, We shouldn't be thinking that just because somebody has been overlooked, they're this neglected talent. The whole thing is fluid. That's what's so great about it. Everybody is constantly thinking about it and rethinking it. I guess in 50 years, can't even say that. The stature of all these artists is constantly shifting.
Yeah. Well, it's something I've said before, but I do think is that every time people talk about how bad things are, I always think, yeah, but the most interesting thing in any time period is always the new stuff from the past that's appearing to you. And there's been a lot of that lately.
Yeah, there's probably been almost too much of that.
Probably, like you're saying, a little too much.
But, like last spring, Donna Nelson had a show at Canada, and Kathy Butterly had a completely career-altering show at James Cohen. And I don't know, that seems like there was probably much more that I didn't see because I was seeing a much smaller percentage than I usually do. But that seemed remarkable to me. And the other thing is that I don't think people, we're used to having young artists break through and burn bright, but having a really good career, it takes a long time to become a good artist. And in both those cases, you have that. Kathy Butterly just sort of dismissed the first 3/4 of her career. If you go back and she's saying, okay, I'm interested in Chinese ceramics and George Orr and painting. And that's it. And that show is so amazing to me. The whole idea of color and just the really plain shapes. You probably didn't even see it, did you?
I definitely did not. I see astoundingly little, sort of because of the speed at which I have to work. And I don't know, just what you're saying makes me think, I do think time is the big thing. It all comes back to time. Like the time to develop a career, the time to develop a thought if you're a writer. I think it's very impressive that you're able to have a thought every week consistently, because it just takes time. I guess in terms of your method, I always think of, for me, the classic Roberta Smith review it was of a Damien Hirst spot painting show when he showed all his spot paintings at all the Gagosian galleries. For me, it was like your exact method, in that your method was to look at all the paintings and say, actually, they're not all the same at all. Clearly different people painted this one and that one. This hand is a little bit better than that one. Goes back to Judd, I guess, but just a real attention to the specificity of the object and getting underneath.
Yeah, but that's all I got. Looking is all I have, really. It was my training. I got a job at Arts Magazine. They gave you a list of 12 galleries and you reviewed them month after month.
The same gallery?
The same galleries.
Oh, that's interesting.
Well, they were shorthanded. They didn't want to have to deal with a lot of writers saying, oh, can I review this?
You just had a beat. Your beat was 12 galleries.
Yeah. All I know is that Ronald Feldman, when he was still on the Upper East Side, was on it. I can't remember anything else. But just looking is the way that you develop anything in the art world, whatever your profession. and accumulating all this stuff in your head and then having it as a screen against which everything else you see then is then projected. You build up this memory. But I think it took me years, decades to really feel I was looking at painting. For me, that's the endless challenge and the endless pleasure, is this weird, incredibly limited handmade medium and what it has encompassed since the beginning of time and what it still gives artists to do. You know? So all you can do is look and think about it. And good, bad, and indifferent. It's never going to be 100% great.
You're not an ideological critic, I wouldn't say. I mean, you've said, literally, I am not that interested in ideology, but I do feel like there's a little bit of an ideology of looking for you. I mean, you do think that the critic is I don't know if it's ethical good, but, you're showing people how to look, and that is a good.
That's what I demonstrate, is how you examine something and how you examine your experience of that thing. And sure, to get back to Judd said art is something you look at. And that was just as conceptual art was emerging, And
I guess I didn't think about that. That's true, isn't it?
And it is. That's what distinguishes it. And I think there's all kinds of art that involves lots of reading, lots of this and that's that. I'm fine with that. I don't like to read standing up. I used to say that. There used to be more reading standing up than there is these days.
I don't know. In a way, when you're talking about being at the times in it feeling, certain imposter complex, I'm sure that's very something people can identify with. I also deeply identify with, you've talked about the incredible regret of being a weekly critic. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's just so much that you don't write about. And I still get that. I walk into galleries and I think, I could write about this. I could have written about the Wilfredo Lamb show and said, guess what? All the great paintings are in the first two galleries, guys, when he's obsessed with Picasso. Forget about trying to fit him into abstract expressionism. That was the meatiest, most exciting part of that show for me. Well, nobody had that opinion. I could have had that opinion.
The regret that you have something to say that no one else
well,
is going to say.
I don't know, I can't make that presumption, but I do feel like, I have all this intention of posting on Instagram, doing little critical snippets, which I haven't done much, and that relates to my foot and my ability to get my daily life organized. I'll still do some of that, but that's what I was built to do, was be some kind of a critic, talking or writing or whatever.
What about regrets in general? You've got a huge, important career. Are there things that you look back on?
I have a really meager social life.
Well, is that because you're not friends with artists? I mean,
that probably contributed to it. That just got too confusing to me. I'm slightly puritanical about things like that. Whatever my limitations are, I want to explore them. I don't want this process contaminated by a lot of input, especially from artists. Like I say, artists do not control the meaning of their art. They can't possibly encompass it all if they're good. There's stuff left over for generation after generation to deal with. A few critics can propose their own interpretations, and not agree. I wish I'd gone to more dinners and more openings, and I was kind of a solitary kid to begin with. I don't think my parents had many friends, so that didn't help, So I have regrets on the personal front, and I have regrets in terms of what I didn't write about, in terms of shows, good, bad, or indifferent, that I would have liked to have weighed in on.
Well, Roberta Smith, thank you so much for talking to me. It's really been a pleasure.
It's been really fun. It's nice to talk to someone again.
That's it for this week's episode. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili, with contributions from Ben Davis and Caroline Goldstein. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.